Hey, welcome back to Unschooled Theology. I am one of your hosts, Derek, and with me here is Evan. Good day to you, sir.
Good day to you, sir.
All right, so we've finally reached, and we've got many episodes, many episodes on this day. We finally reached day 6, the final day of creation, the climax, the creation of humanity. Although we're not going to get to that today. Today we're going to talk about the first part of the day 6 creation, and that's going to be Genesis 1, 24, and 25. So real quick, I will read it as is our way. And God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, livestock and creeping things, and beasts of the earth according to their kinds. And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. So the first thing that really jumped out at me about this is that we do not get our familiar, recognizable, what we've seen all the way up till this point, let there be, right? That we've been getting a
Distinct.
let there be.
Yep.
And here we don't get that, and which is interesting. And I think
Yeah.
it's revealing, though. I think this is showing us something about God's order and God's creation, in that he describes these as being sprung forth from the earth, because I think it's a way of showing us that the earth contains what we need to maintain life and survive, right? The sustenance is there for us. It's a way of sort of signaling that once God has created something, a life, a living thing, everything he did in the previous days was built up to this point, and everything that was done before is so that this thing will be sustained, right? And God doesn't need to keep saying let there be's in order for this life to continue forward and to be sustained. The earth itself contains the things that are necessary for supporting life. And that gives us a clue to his design. We talk about God's order versus the chaos. And I look at this as being sort of a major clue about God's order, is that the world has what we need now. No more, the physical resources necessary to sustain life exist. There's no need for new acts of creation, because those things were already put in place on the previous days.
So in essence, it's almost like if we're talking about God as the proverbial clockmaker, this is the point at which the clock has been set properly,
Right.
And now can continue to function
right
in a almost self-sustaining manner.
Yes.
Yeah, that's
yes.
Interesting. That's very interesting. I think your interpretation is the spiritual one, which I think is a, like we said, we didn't say it's always superior, but I think it is a good interpretation. I have a potential functional interpretation of this.
Okay.
That I'd be curious to see what you think of. I view it as, and this might upset some people, but potentially as a validation of an evolutionary thinking. Let the earth bring forth living creatures. And it kind of relates to yours. If we're talking functionally, how did the creatures come about?
Right.
Well, if the earth is bringing them forth, whereas the other creatures that we see before, God initiates life within them, and then they naturally bring forth the other creatures.
Before you go further, I'm going to bring up something we've talked about before that does actually relate to this. So we've talked about the different words for create here. And that there is a particular one that's used in the very beginning when God creates the heavens and the earth, the bara creation.
Bara creation, yeah.
We don't see that bara creation again until we get to, not here, actually. It's not until we get to day 5 with the creation of sea creatures, basically. The introduction of this kind of life on earth. Now, what we had talked about before, and I guess we should say this too, there are some scholars and analysts or whatnot who would basically say that uh, the use of the term create outside of those bara creation moments is maybe not quite the right way to think of it. The term make might actually make a little more sense.
Okay.
Because it has to do with adjusting what already God already created, right? So he created something ex nihilo, the matter and the material, and now he's forming it, right? And so make might be the better term there. And we talked about the idea of this bara creation. I posited anyways, the idea that when this happens, this is very clearly God taking we talked about at the beginning, the heavens and the earth, the spiritual and the sort of matter-based worlds, and perfectly mixing the two, really bringing something from the spiritual to bear on the earthly portion of things. I talked about the idea that was maybe what the bara creation is the mixture of these two things. And then you could look at life in the term of sea creatures as being that, right? As being the mixture of this bara creation. But then when we get to animals, to your point here, we're not getting that bara description of the creation of animals here. We're getting something more like this making, more like taking what already exists and bringing that forth.
Bringing it in.
And if you follow the fossil record and those kind of things, you go from water-based creatures to the land-based creatures. Now the birds, that gets a little tricky in there. I don't know how that would work in that. That would be
not entirely
something you'd have to think about. But it is interesting to note that it follows that pattern, and perhaps the word choices we see here might indicate the idea of the making of animals coming from the bara creation of the sea creatures. And that animals are more of a forming of this life, a making of this life, rather than this sort of newly created bara creation type thing. But yeah, and we should say, I'll just point out real quick too, for people who might be bothered by that, there are many Christians who would say that evolution is a thing and it was just a process set into motion by God, like a computer program set to run or something like that. And then there's also people like Hugh Ross, who would argue for something, and I think this is where I generally fall, the idea that no, like the fossil record and those things all sort of make sense, but and this is a case people make, that mathematically there's not enough time, even as long as the several billion years, it's still not enough time for as many random
variations.
Random variations, and then to be sort of reproduced within a community and all of that. There's not really enough time mathematically for that to occur, and that's the math is compelling, I think, if you do look closely at it. And so they would argue that creation follows that process, it's just more managed, and it's like someone designing something and making a change here and then a change here and then a change here to build up to this thing that they want to produce at the end. And that's not to say God couldn't do it another way. Of course, God could do it another way, but that by doing it in this way, creation would be more understandable to us. If we could see this pattern would reveal something to us about who God is, and that creation itself would be more understandable to us, which is something that I think is important as we get a few episodes down the road here and talk about why man is created, the purpose of man, what it means to be the image of God, all of those kind of things. Understanding how creation works and how you get from one thing to the next actually is vital to the purpose for which man is created within creation.
What would you say it reveals? You said it would reveal something.
So I think, well, I think it reveals again an ordered sense of the universe, right? And so the more we understand how you get from one creature to the next and the way in which they differ, each according to its kind, you understand how the puzzle of this order that God is setting up works together.
Hmm. So an evolutionary lens provides that understanding.
So it's not so much an evolutionary lens provides that. Simply seeing, it doesn't have to be evolutionary. I guess I'm saying you could look at it evolutionary, or you could look at it as someone like Hugh Ross, where it's like this managed iterative process, right?
Mm-hmm.
Either perspective there shows allows you to see a logic, right? A pattern, an underlying pattern. And God's order here clearly has a pattern to it. That's what we've been shown, in Genesis 1 up until this point, is there are patterns to God's creation, each according to its kind. I mean, that phrase explains that there's a pattern, right? Because
Okay.
you can't have a pattern without having each according to its kind, right? To have a pattern, if I have triangle, circle, I have to have circles according to their kind and triangles according to their kind. You know what I mean? So that even that phrase implies a sense of pattern to things. And so, yeah, thinking of creation this way, seeing one creature as being developed from the next to the point where you get these different creatures that are built out of changes and adjustments and ways in which they're pushed apart from each other, that reveals the pattern of creation, or at least something about the pattern of creation, and the pattern of God's order.
Interesting. Yeah, agreed.
So, okay. All right. So yeah, so that's one way, I guess, of thinking about animals, and we'll come back to animals, I'm sure, several times here. But I want to move on real quick to something that this is not a fully thought out idea yet. It's not like, I mean, some of the other things I talk about here, I've thought about a little more. It's not that I'm necessarily right about everything. It's just I have a more fully formed understanding of what I'm talking about. But the next thing I want to talk about here real quick is these three categories that are described. Like, I don't think it's there for no reason. And so that asks, naturally, the question I ask then is, okay, what is the reason? Why are you describing things these three ways?
Yeah.
And this goes to what we previously discussed a few episodes ago about animals being of a lower order than humans, and humans being of a lower order than God, right? So things of a higher order, things of a lower order. And we'll get more into the why humans are of a different order in a couple of episodes here. But I'm saying let's take that as a given for a moment, all right? And presume that humans are of a higher order, because we at least live that way, right? At least everybody acts as though that is true, right? Even if they don't all intellectually make that case, everyone acts as though that's true. Even in light of something you and I were talking about off air before, but even in light of the sort of either a naturalist perspective or perhaps even an environmentalist perspective or a very sympathetic to animals perspective, humans are held to a higher standard than all other animals, right? Even those who would argue, well, humans should be vegan for moral reasons. You're giving humans the ability to make a choice that you're not giving other creatures the ability to, right? Humans aren't the only omnivore. There are other creatures that are omnivores, but we don't condemn those creatures when they choose to take a life in order to eat, right? But with humans, we do. And or at least I don't, but with humans, even the moral vegans do, right? They hold humans accountable for that. So even on that level, in which normally you might say that those people are looking at humans as being equal to animals, and they might even describe themselves as viewing things that way, they clearly don't believe that if you're holding humans accountable in a way that you're not holding other creatures accountable.
I think if we're,
You're treating humans as though they're a level above.
I think it's best to continue with the other point, because one could easily contend and say, well, just because you're saying something is sentient or not sentient, that doesn't mean you're talking about value.
I don't know that I'm talking about value either. I'm talking about just
yeah, that's why
order.
the idea why the idea of higher order or lower order needs to be better defined, but we don't need to define that right now. We can define that at a later date. If you're continuing,
it's a very old idea. It's a very traditional idea that goes back to ancient man, even, right? That there are these beings of different orders and different levels. So
correct.
I almost don't even know how to define it better, but
well, but functionally, as a 21st century person, we don't think of things. I was never taught that in school. The idea that humans are of a different order.
No,
that's maybe an old scholastic idea, but that's not one that's outlined.
I think it's an old spiritual idea. Yeah, it's not one we've talked about. In very modern times. It's something, I mean, I think people were familiar with for a very long time. I think you'd go even into the Middle Ages. I think probably industrialization, we don't speak in those terms as much anymore.
Correct. Which is why it's an idea that requires better outlining. But you don't need to outline it at this moment. We can outline it at a later time.
I don't disagree. I just want to say one more thing related to that, though. I think if you are in a more agricultural society where you are interacting with these animals on a regular basis, obviously, if you're running the farm, if you're in that situation, this idea of these different orders, you can see it very naturally, right? But now we're not in this. I mean, most of us, the only time you spend with animals is, you might happen across a squirrel or bird outside or something,
you have a pet,
or you have a pet, or you go to a zoo specifically to see them. But this is not the same as them being a significant part of your life in the way that they would have been for people prior to industrialization, right? And so that's why I think we've lost the ability to see that. But I guess my point in bringing up the way people act is that instinctually that sentiment is still there, I guess, is what I'm saying, and it may not be perfectly defined, but instinctually people still see themselves as on a different order than animals. So building off that premise, though, right? The reason God would create these different orders then within creation, right? Why not put humans at the same level as animals, or have animals at the same level as humans? Why not have all life at that one basic level? Is so that we might better understand our relationship with God, right? God is clearly a being of a higher order than we are. So in order to then understand what it means to be a being of lower order than a being of higher order, animals give us some insight into that, right? Because we can see them compared to ourselves, and then be able to look at that and compare ourselves to God. Mm-hmm. And so there are these three categories then, in light of this line of thinking. My thought here is that potentially these three categories, their relationship with man is a reflection of the different ways man might have a relationship with God. Mm-hmm. And this is generalized here, but so are these categories. These categories are very generalized. So you have livestock, you have creeping things, and you have beasts of the earth, And generally, if you look at the way what these groups were meant to represent in the Hebrew language, the livestock is kind of the animals that regularly are interacting with man in this kind of cooperative sense, right?
Yeah.
There's a very cooperative relationship between man and these animals.
Well, that comes through in the English translation too. Livestock is fairly
I think so.
self-explanatory.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't reference a wild lion as livestock.
No, but a dog would be maybe included in this category here, and we don't call that livestock, you know.
Yeah, not as much.
But pets would sort of fall into that that window here.
Yeah.
Creeping things are those creatures which are alive but are indifferent, right? The creeping things, it literally means, you know, low to the ground. And in a way, they just exist around man, but are sort of ignorant of man unless they come into conflict with man, and that's how that works. And then lastly is the beasts of the earth, and these were the creatures that would have been predators, would have been threats, you know, a lion, something like that. And they were a threat to man. And so if we think of these things in terms of relationship, you have livestock, which exists, and they live lives that are in service of man. And that is a reflection then of one of the relationships that man can have to God, which is that we can exist in service to God, in service of what he has laid out for us to do. In the creeping things, you have an indifference to man, just going about its life, you know, doing whatever. And man can live a life that is more or less indifferent to God. That is something man can do. And then lastly, the beasts of the earth, which are antagonistic to man, and man can be antagonistic towards God. And we can't necessarily, it's not like we're a threat to God the way the beasts of the earth are a threat to man, although it should be noted that as we've become more capable, the beasts of the earth become less and less a threat to man. I have no fear of being eaten by a lion or a tiger anymore because we've found ways to contain them in sort of our advanced societies. But describing them as antagonistic is still maybe the right description, because when I go to the zoo and I visit the tiger, there are times where that tiger will prowl the edge of the cage and very much would love to come after me if it were possible, right? And that is one of the attitudes we can have towards God, is this antagonistic attitude, right? This sort of defiance, this sort of rebellious nature, which is not indifferent, but it is actually antagonistic. It's being angry with God, being upset with God, whatever, right? You know, these kind of attitudes, that's a relationship we can have with God. So this isn't, like I said, it's not fully fleshed out, but it's just it's one way, I guess, and the only one I have at the moment, of answering the question, why describe these three categories? It's not necessary to. You could just say creatures of the earth, right? But you specifically list these three different categories in ways where, because we have a very materialistic perspective, we would not group creatures together in the way that this does. This groups them together in a very curious way. You know, the fact that you would include, I mean, creeping things is like insects and mice are like in the same category. And obviously from a materialistic perspective, that makes very little sense to do. But functionally,
it makes sense.
It makes a little more sense, you know, in terms of this relationship with man. So that's sort of my, for now at least, where I sort of stand on why we have these three categories.
Yeah, it makes sense that in an ancient context, somebody would categorize things based on their functionality and their relationship to humanity.
Yeah,
because it does. Because that's what is most significant about animals to ancient man, is the way in which they relate to them. And I think it's proper to say that we would take a more materialistic view, because because our interactions with animals are, like you said, limited.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have as much frequent interaction with them, so we don't really need to be concerned with our functional relationship with them, and therefore can look at them simply materialistically.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
mm-hmm. And throw them into those categories based on that.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. I think I mean, as far as the grounds you would have for that interpretation, I don't know if they're incredibly strong, but I don't know if that matters as much, because it's as reasonable interpretation as any other one someone could potentially present, I think.
Right.
And I think it's reasonable. I mean, livestock is very clearly an easy interpretation of saying that those are functionally useful to humans. And then the other two categories is reasonable. I mean, saying indifference versus beasts of the earth.
Yeah.
I don't think this necessarily, well, if you're defining this though by perspective, it is reasonable then to say that the issue that you run into is like, okay, well, are we saying lions are evil? No, but we are saying that from the human perspective, they do certainly, if we can draw this functionality into then a spiritual perspective, you could say that antagonism towards my being is potentially evil. And if you want to then extend it, antagonism towards God is then potentially evil.
Yeah, it's so this gets into one of the interesting components of these beings of different order, because one of the most interesting components of this idea is the idea of morality. And the point here would be that morality doesn't cross these hierarchical lines. It doesn't make sense to call the lion evil. Like it's a threat, maybe, and it may do things we don't like, and it may be dangerous. It would be not good if we can go to some of the more stuff we'll get here in Genesis. We talked about this a little, right? The idea that this is good and the other stuff is not necessarily evil. It's just not good from God's perspective. So we could say that the lion is, in those circumstances where it's a threat to us, not good. Where it's antagonistic to us, it's not good, right? But it's to claim like evil or this like moral component, it doesn't quite make sense. And part of what we might take from looking at and saying it doesn't make sense for us to sort of impose our morality upon the lion, and it doesn't make sense for the lion to sort of judge us by whatever its ideas of morality are, clearly. If the lion eats someone, and this is common in an African village, if the lion eats a villager, the village goes and hunts down the lion and kills him, right? Because that lion has shown to be this antagonistic threat and to exceed the boundaries of where it should be, I guess, is a way of saying it, within the order of that community and that sort of ecosystem there. And I'm sure the lion looks at that when that's happening and it's being hunted down and killed and thinks, what evil humans, although they don't really think of you as humans, they just think of you as different lions, because they only see creatures as themselves, more or less. And like my dog looks at me and says, I'm a dog that somehow does different things. It doesn't, and this is why when we look at God, interpret God we anthropomorphize him, because that's the best we can understand. We can't understand which is beyond us. But I guess the point is, the lion, it doesn't make sense for the lion to look at the villagers hunting them down and saying, well, they're evil, right? Or put that sort of moral component on it. The same is true of us and God. And we'll get into this in much more detail when we look at like Noah's Ark. But
the question then becomes, what do we do with people who are antagonistic to God? Well, what do we categorize them as?
Well, that's not good. Again, good and not good, right? And I would have found
the indifference as not good, whereas I would have found the antagonism, you think so, as potentially being bad. So if we're fleshing that out,
could be, I guess, if we want to that's fair, I guess, because I think we'll get to this when we get to Adam and Eve, but I think the serpent falls in very much into the category of the antagonistic, whereas
Agreed.
Frankly, Adam falls in the category of indifferent.
Of indifferent, exactly.
Yeah, and Eve, the category misguided. So that's fair. I mean, you could do that, I guess. I guess I'm talking here more about judging upwards, if you will. It's sort of like it doesn't make sense for us to impose our ideas of what is moral upon God, because how could we understand that? Just like the lion can't understand in the slightest where the humans that are killing
that's not what I'm suggesting. What I'm suggesting is imposing it downwards.
Right.
What I'm suggesting is, if this is to highlight a picture of our relationship with the divine, then
does it? Yeah.
Are we then saying that lions are evil? And it's like, well, or bad, or any word you want to slip in there, I guess. Well, then not exactly, but we are saying that we would much prefer to be around creatures that are, and we do spend more times, especially pre-industrialization, more time around creatures that are not antagonistic.
Agreed.
Towards us.
Agreed.
In fact, we have a difficult time managing creatures that are antagonistic towards us. Like taming a lion is a difficult thing, and finding a way to make it so it's possible to relate closely with them, that is difficult without having many barriers between us for safety. And so
is it ever really tamed?
Exactly.
I mean, Siegfried and Roy, the one of them being attacked by the tamed tiger,
Well, exactly. So managing and being able to associate with that is very difficult if the creature is antagonistic. And then even if it's indifferent, it's not necessarily potentially harmful to deal with the creature, but it also is not, it's not something that people frequently want to do. And it's a rare person who wants to deal with it. It's like the person who has I'm going to upset the one person out of our listenership who has a beaver as a pet, but like people who have a beaver as a pet, it's kind of like, well, the beaver is there and it exists, and they probably will contend, well, it shows me affection. It's like, well, yeah, maybe it does or doesn't. I don't know, but it certainly doesn't show as much affection as a dog typically would.
Yeah, bunnies are common.
And then serve as, oh, really? Bunnies don't show affection, or they do?
No, people do have bunnies as a pet, and I've heard multiple people who have had bunnies as pets describe them as jerks, right? And I think it's really
exactly.
It's kind of that indifferent nature that comes from them. Yeah,
exactly.
But you're certainly not going to see the affection, that you see. Yeah,
that the other animals potentially have, and I think that potentially, if you're using this as an illustration, that's a more helpful lens for thinking about how humanity relates and interacts with the divine. Like if you are antagonistic towards it, it's not simply that you're receiving punishment. It also is more so that it's like oil and water. It doesn't interact properly if you're antagonistic towards it.
You're managing the problem. Right, just like the villagers are managing the problem of the lion, and sometimes the only solution is to go out and kill the lion. Correct. Otherwise, the lion's going to kill them. Right.
Yeah, and at best, establish either distance between you and that, or establish a fence between you and that which is antagonistic. That's how you defend yourself against it. It's not to suggest that God requires defense.
Yeah, we're not
se, but it is saying that it doesn't function properly.
And that's
establishing a real relationship with it is not possible.
We're not a threat to God, but given that we exist in this earth and have free will, we are a threat to God's order. If we're antagonistic, we aren't a threat to God, but we are a threat to his order. Mm-hmm. As long as he allows us the free will to act within this world. We are a threat to that. And since God is describing repeatedly here in Genesis 1 his order as good, we become a threat to that which is good. Mm-hmm. And you could, I guess, take that out further in the sense that God is the source of all that is good. you're a threat to God in that way. But it's like, I mean, that's obviously, it's not a one-to-one. It can't be, because we'll never be God. But it gives us an idea of that relationship between man and God.
Yeah, correct.
And so in terms of, do you describe the lion as evil? Do you describe the people as evil? I don't know. I guess maybe that's the right word for it.
I don't think it. I don't think
it's
you then. I think the question is probably more better framed as we're talking about it, is not do you describe it as evil, but does that give you a better perspective of what evil is?
Oh, it could be.
So you're not placing the morality on there, but it does give you a better perspective of what it looks like to be bad, of what it looks like to be evil. And antagonistic is, antagonistic to divine order or to God himself is not that is a more reasonable way of defining evil. So again, if we're using this as an image, if we're saying, okay, well, this is a perspective, this is an image for us to be able to better understand and comprehend what is our interplay between God, then it's far less significant of how we're judging the animals, but far more significant of how we view the animals, to understand how then God would view us.
Right.
So that gives us a better way of looking at it, of saying, okay, well, evil seems to be some type of antagonism towards it. And it makes sense that would be difficult for then a relationship to be formed. And even indifference potentially runs that same risk, not the exact same risk, but something of a risk.
Right.
Right.
No, I think that's the right idea. And so you see, I guess, why, I mean, who's to say if this is the quote unquote correct interpretation or a correct interpretation? But you see, even in this discussion, how there's something compelling to that idea, and it's potentially a useful framework for trying to better understand God and our relationship with God. So that's sort of where I sit with this idea. But with that, I think we're gonna set aside the animals, at least for now, and move on to the rest of this in our next episode, and look at the creation of man. So we'll be there next time. Be sure to like, subscribe, follow, all those things, and hit us up with questions in the comments of whatever platform you're on, or shoot us an email, unschooledtheology@protonmail.com, and we'll be back soon.